Hi, everyone. So before we begin, we would like to thank everyone for coming here today, specifically Mr. Ashkenazi, Mrs. Abadie, and Mrs. Tokayer in the back, for guiding and supporting us throughout this entire process. So as we began to prepare for this presentation, we sat around a conference table and discussed our family histories. We all came to these shores at different moments in time, we all took different routes, and yet we all wound up in the United States. This led us to our foundational question: why America? What did Syrian Jews know about America, and when did it become a destination? In our research, we came across photographic evidence of interactions between Western visitors and the Jewish inhabitants of Aleppo and Damascus, Syria. The Bonfils family of France actually photographed Jewish houses, as did the American colony, a Christian community based in Jerusalem. It is not far-fetched to imagine that visitors such as these spoke to the inhabitants of Syria about Europe, the United States, and the larger Western world.
We also found literary evidence of travel to Aleppo by European scholars who referenced the Jewish community and whose interaction with the local inhabitants contributed to an expanded knowledge of the broader world. Dr. Alex Russell, an Englishman, settled in Syria in 1740 and became Aleppo's chief medical practitioner. Upon his return to England in 1754, he wrote The Natural History of Aleppo. Scottish Christian missionary John Wilson also spent time in Syria and described his observations in the lands of the Bible. Missionaries were an important source of information for Jews and others in the Middle East, often spreading Western culture along with their Christian ideology. European Jewish travelers spent time with Jewish community of Syria as well. Among them is Eastern European scholar Ephraim Newmark, who visited Jewish communities in Syria and the Middle East. In an effort to promote trade, the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Syria until World War I, signed capitulation agreements with various nations. According to these agreements, traders entering the Ottoman Empire were exempt from local prosecution, local taxation, local conscription, and the searching of their domicile. They were essentially citizens of the country they were affiliated with and received their protection. They were not subject to Ottoman laws. A number of Jews served as consuls for the European countries and for the United States. These consuls and their associates maintained close connections with the Western world. The most prominent family to serve in this role was the Pechotto family. They and others were referred to as the Francos, having settled in Syria in the 1700s and having maintained their European identity.
On February 5, 1840, an affair known as the Damascus blood libel took place. One of the accused Jews, Isaac Levi Pechotto, was an Austrian citizen and was under the protection of the Austrian Council. His citizenship eventually led to the intervention of Austria, England, and the United States in the affair. Western Jewry had been shocked by what had happened, and vigorous protests were voiced, increasing interaction between the Jews of Syria and the broader Jewish world. The Damascus affair brought the Jewish world together, resulting in the establishment of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. The Alliance eventually opened schools across the Middle East. In 1869, an Alliance school for boys opened in Aleppo. 20 years later, they opened a school for girls as well. The Alliance schools offered the Jews of Aleppo secular education, including French, commercial correspondence, and later English. In retrospect, these schools prepared Syrian Jews for emigration. In addition, some Jewish families also sent their students to foreign schools or even missionary schools.
We also have reports of Syrians, Christians, Muslims, and Jews traveling to the United States for world fairs. Syrian Christians marketed products made of wood at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876. They brought back stories of their visit, and their products created more interest in Syria from American merchants. By 1904, Syrian Jews were in attendance at the St. Louis World Fair. We did not come across a smoking gun. The moment when Syrian Jewry began to see the United States as a land of opportunity, instead we found a number of small events that put America on the map for Syrian Jews. Aleppo, once an important trading center connecting East and West, declined following the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. The Jews, looking for new opportunities, began venturing beyond Syria to other areas in the Middle East, to Europe, and by the turn of the 20th century, the New World.
My grandmother, born Ruth Sutton in Jerusalem, came to the United States of America in 1958. But her story truly begins half a century before her journey with the birth of her mother, then Bahia Shayo, in Aleppo, Syria in 1909. Sarah Shayo, my great-grandmother's mother, lost her husband when Bahia was a very young girl. However, she refused any form of aid from those around her, resolute in her endeavor to raise her children on her own. As a result, Bahia spent her childhood sewing, cooking, and cleaning to help raise enough money to support her family. Sarah's children were never resentful of their duties, nor their lack of access to continuous education, knowing that their mother loved them and was trying to raise them the way she thought was best. When Bahia turned 16, she was set up with a wealthy Aleppan merchant 3 times her age and twice a widower by the name of Hillel Menashe Sutton. Hillel came from a prominent family of scholars and rabbis in the Syrian Jewish community, and in addition to his deep devotion to religion, was extremely successful in the business of the import and exportation of textiles to and from Europe and Asia. Preceding his marriage to Bahia, Hillel was a father to 5 daughters and had lost twin sons along with both of his previous wives. From the moment they were married, Bahia was unwaveringly devoted to her husband. After having 3 children together, and in light of economic decline in Aleppo, Hillel sent his 2 younger brothers off on a boat to live in America, where he had heard of increased financial opportunity. Jack and Joe settled in New Orleans, Louisiana, where they prospered after creating their own chains of retail stores and hotels. Knowing of his brother's success in America, Hillel sent his daughters from his previous marriages to live with their uncles in New Orleans. Less than a year later, in 1934, Hillel, always connected to the Holy Land at heart, and Bahia, pregnant with the couple's 4th child, made their way to Israel on camelback, led by a group of Arabs who had no patience for young children or tired women. Upon their arrival, though they were given a year's grace period in light of Avadia's birth, Bahia learned that she and her children did not have valid visas to live in Israel under the British Mandate, with their strict Jewish immigration laws put in place in the interwar period. Bahia and her young children traveled back to Syria, once again on camelback, and this time without her husband. Back in Syria, Bahia went to the immigration offices every day without fail to obtain passage for herself and her children back to Israel in 1935. After the birth of their 5th child, Abraham, in 1938, the Suttons moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, where in 1940, my grandmother and namesake was born. The Sutton children were happy growing up in Jerusalem. They lived in beautiful homes, always had company on Shabbat and holidays, and attended Alliance schools where they learned French and English in addition to Hebrew. Towards the end of World War II, however, affairs in Israel became complicated, and Hillel's thoughts fell once again to America. Before their hopes of making the journey to America could be realized, the United Nations approved the 1947 partition plan, and the Suttons found themselves caught in the midst of a war. Much to her dismay, Bahia's children did not attend school in 1948. They couldn't. And so, while hiding in their bomb shelters, with her husband risking his life walking 5 miles each day to get fresh bread for the 6 families forced to live together for months, Bahia made sure her children always had a good book to read, even if she had to write it herself. The Suttons' home was destroyed during the war, and Bahia, despite her air of calm and nerves of steel during the worst of the fighting, insisted on moving back to Tel Aviv to escape the immediate horrors of the war. On the morning of Simchat Torah in 1949, Hillel complained of chest pains and passed away an hour later in his sleep. Over 1,000 people attended his funeral. Bahia was just 40 years old. Without her husband to support her with his business, Bahia had almost nothing. She lived in a small house with her 6 children, who, despite the hardship it brought her, she swore to herself would only attend the best schools they possibly could to ensure success in their futures. Bahia took up sewing again, as when she was a girl, and spent hours attaining scholarships for her children to attend schools like Gila, prestigious in the sciences and alma mater to men like Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres. After serving in the army, Meir, Bahia's eldest son, got a student visa and went to America just as his father had planned. Following his own graduation in 1957, Bahia forced Abraham to go to America as well, despite his longing to serve in the Israeli Defense Force, because it was too harrowing for her to see yet another son off to risk his life every day with no means of communication. When he reached New Orleans, Abraham's uncle told him that he must go by Al in America, and he did so until his passing. After working in America for a year, Al was able to save enough to bring Avadia and Ruth to New York. When Bahia tried to follow her children, in an event that reminded her all too well of past experiences, she was forced to reside in Mexico for months because her visa had expired and she couldn't become a resident. Thankfully, by 1960, the Suttons in America were together again, living in both New York and New Jersey as they still are today. I asked my grandmother Ruth to describe her mother. She said, "She was so put together. She was a lady in the full sense of the word. She held the family together. Family really meant so much to her. She was a trooper. She raised all of us without a father. She had a lot of hardships from Syria to Israel. Her husband died, war was going on, but she never complained. She did what she had to do, and she did a great job raising us. She was a quiet lady. She had a hard pregnancy in Turkey. In Israel, she was unbelievable, how she adapted to the Hebrew language and learned English, running the whole show. She was a father and a mother, and it was a hard time then. It wasn't easy as it is now. She had hardships, but she handled it, always with a smile."
So, my great-grandfather, Yaakov Shamosh, was born in Aleppo, Syria. In 1932, he left Syria to help build a new synagogue in Iskenderun, a Turkish port city close to the Syrian border. His family name was not originally Shamosh. He was given that name because of his commitment to the synagogue, and the title stuck. Following the UN partition plan and the establishment of the State of Israel, life became increasingly difficult for Jews in Syria, and while the majority of the community had left prior to 1947, the 4,000 Jews remaining in Aleppo were stuck. The Syrian government would not let them out, and relying on smugglers was their only ticket to freedom. Conscious of his Aleppan roots, my great-grandfather and my grandfather Aaron jumped into action. Working with a network of trusted smugglers and a system of signal codes, they helped Jews get out of Aleppo. Jews would have to leave all their property behind and put their life in the hands of Arab smugglers. The smugglers would bribe Syrian custom officials, and then they would walk 5 or 6 hours to the Turkish border. At the border, my great-grandfather or my grandfather would greet the escapees and would provide them with their first taste of freedom. Escapees would arrive on Thursday and would stay with my family through Shabbat. On Sunday or Monday, my family would see them onto a boat to Israel. So something cool, actually, somebody from Flatbush, one of their parents or grandparents, I believe it was Frida Dabo, her parents were actually one of my grandfather helped them escape Syria. And that happens a lot. We happen to see a lot of people come up to my grandparents when we're walking, and they'll tell them, my grandfather, it was 3,500 Jews to 4,000 Jews that my grandfather helped smuggle out. So he'll tell them that you saved me, and he's like, "Oh, what's your name?" And we'll have a conversation with them, and it's really very enlightening to see that. While my family worked in secret for decades, their actions became known to the broader Jewish community. My great-grandfather worked in coordination with the Jewish Agency in Israel, and they thanked him for his efforts as early as 1960s, which you can see on the screen. My grandfather was honored in 1996 by Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres, also on the screen. While these plaques and letters hold a place of honor in my grandparents' home, it is the appreciation we receive from people who were saved by my family that mean the most. 4 years ago, we were visiting Israel for my bar mitzvah. While we were in a synagogue in Tel Aviv, a number of congregants recognized my grandfather. He helped them get out of Syria, and then they had spent Shabbat with my grandfather's family. They honored him, gave him an Aliyah, and treated him like a hero. It was the highlight of my bar mitzvah trip.
My grandmother grew up in Beirut, Lebanon during a time of peace. The Jews were treated well by their Christians and Muslim neighbors. Some of my grandmother's closest friends were actually Christians, with whom she went to school with after high school. To this day, my grandmother is still in touch with these friends who still live in Lebanon. Life in Lebanon was great for the Jews. They were prospering economically and were able to provide for their children while also giving them a secular education, thanks to the Alliance schools. However, all this changed during the 1970s. In 1975, a civil war broke out in Lebanon between the Christians and the Muslims. The Jews were caught in the middle, accused by both sides of being spies for the other. With tensions rising from years before, many Jews decided to leave. They went to places like Mexico, Canada, France, Italy, and America, anywhere that they had relatives. Alternatively, some of the Lebanese Jews decided to stay. Amongst them was my grandfather, my grandmother, and their families. One October night in 1975, there was a loud banging on my grandmother's apartment. My grandmother, who was 3 months pregnant with my mother at the time, opened it to find 2 Arab soldiers pointing guns directly at her. They accused her of being a spy and were about to arrest her. My great-grandmother ran in and told the men that she was pregnant, and since the Arab men had respect for pregnant women, They left her alone, and they didn't arrest her that night. That night, my grandmother's life was spared. However, it was known that once someone is accused of being a spy, their life would continue to be in danger forever. That night, my grandparents left their home with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They took the first flight available to Paris, France, to stay with cousins, and left thinking that they would return to Lebanon in a month, when the war calmed down. Little did they know that they would never see their country ever again. In France, my grandfather had to work night and day to make money to support my grandmother and my mother, who was born soon after they got to Paris. After 2 years of living there, my grandparents were finally able to get papers to come to America. Their families, who were scattered all around the world, were able to unite here in America. There were Syrian Jews who were relatives of theirs, and as well as many Lebanese Jews living in New York already. Most of the Lebanese lived in one apartment building, allowing them to bond with each other and help them start their lives anew. After coming to America, my grandparents had to start from scratch. When they came, they had no money and a big family to support. They created a wholesale costume jewelry company where they both still work to at this day. At first, they did not make a lot of money, barely enough to get by. But slowly but surely, their business expanded and they were able to make a steady income. My grandparents, along with the countless other Middle Eastern Jews, fled their countries with nothing. Through hard work and perseverance, they were able to prosper and embrace the opportunity at a new life in America. Thank you.
So my family remained in Aleppo until 1992. At that point, there were only approximately 4,000 Jews in Syria, many desperate to join family members in the United States or Israel. The small Jewish community in Aleppo felt like a dying community, and my grandparents dreamed of starting over in the United States. However, following the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, immigration became increasingly difficult. Throughout most of the period, it was completely illegal, or when legalized for a brief window, Jews would have to abandon all of their property. In 1980, my grandfather Victor left Syria and visited the United States and Brazil. His brother owned a restaurant in New York, and he came to help him. He also went to visit his sister-in-law in Brazil. He needed special permission from the Syrian government to embark on this journey, and he was not allowed to bring any of his family members with him. The Syrian government wanted to ensure that he returned. I always thought that this brief visit provided my grandfather with a taste of freedom, and that he returned to Syria dreaming of a free life in America. But actually, his visit was eventful, and after he was held up at gunpoint, he told his brother, "I am never coming back." My grandfather returned and remained in Syria with his family for another 12 years. He owned a restaurant and a candy store and was one of the first Jews in Aleppo to own a car and a house phone. Despite his bad experience in New York, he still dreamed of bringing his family to the United States and did consider smuggling them out. The risks were high. Those who were caught could be killed, and the remaining family could face dire consequences. He chose to wait. In 1992, the Syrian government agreed to release their Jews. My grandfather heard the news on TV right before Passover. The Jews of Syria were liberated. My grandfather started to plan their journey. He knew there was no future for the Jews in Syria, but he was also afraid. Would he be able to rebuild his life and start his life again in America? Thank you.